Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, is in trouble. German Chancellor Angela Merkel is one of the main supporters of the agreement, but her view seems to be in the minority. Her Vice Chancellor said negotiations between the United States and the European Union were dead in the water. Europe's chief negotiator has denied that claim, but acknowledged that progress has been limited, blaming U.S. intransigence. And as Merkel was suffering defeat in the recent German elections, anti-TTIP protesters took to the streets of Berlin. So what are the problems with the so-called free trade deal between these major market players? Why do its proponents continue to insist that it can and should be realized? And with turmoil in politics besetting both Europe and the United States, what is the likely effect on the outcome of this major economic initiative? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Charles Liu, founder of Hell Capital, and Professor Paul Gillies from Guanhua School of Management in Peking University. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
More than 100,000 people across Germany have protested against the massive transatlantic trade deal. The TTIP talks between the European Union and the United States have been on the rocks for months, but negotiators are at least still talking.
I don't think that people have a problem with globalization, but they have a problem with treaties which have a big impact on democracy, which have a big impact on the right of parliaments to make law.
According to a survey conducted in Germany this April, only 17% of Germans support TTIP. That approval rate is much lower than the 55% when the negotiations first started in 2013. People are concerned about the negative impact of the deal on agriculture, medical care, food safety and labour rights in Europe. Although many may still believe in the long-term economic benefits of TTIP, whether governments can afford the short-term political costs remains a question. The UK's vote for Brexit this June was a setback to the negotiation. It means TTIP will lose a big market and a key supporter of free trade. Under the new wave of anti-globalization, tests took place in Europe and the US in succession, and the EU has said it is likely to be impossible to reach agreement by the end of this year.
So you play off the different chapters against each other. And therefore, until they are all negotiated, or at least a very large number of them are negotiated, I wouldn't expect any of them to basically be concluded. They may be concluded at the technical level, but you still need the political decision, the political agreement of the scope for the whole of TTIP to be agreed. And that's very difficult, given that right now we have elections in the United States and also the major economies of Europe in the next 12 months.
Big differences remain in the areas of market access, specific regulation and the supervision system. Whether those differences can be overcome, particularly in the face of the upcoming US presidential election, remains a major question.
Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. In an age of globalization, particularly for multilateral trade negotiations, which word is taken more seriously, free trade or fair trade?
I think the idea of fair trade has really gained traction, and that people are afraid that free trade has tended to disadvantage many in society who are not getting the benefits of it, but are actually just bearing the costs of free trade.
Your take, Charles?
Well, I think one has to define fair trade a little more broadly, because the concept of fair trade means different things to different people, and the arguments of different countries in negotiations, in the trade discussions on negotiations.
But one thing is sure, I'm afraid, that fair trade is about domestic politics.
Exactly. And free trade is also domestic politics, is who has the upper hand in domestic politics in dictating the terms that's to be negotiated. So in any such multilateral discussion, you will have winners, you will have losers. People lose out. The three decades of globalization has shown that very clearly, that segments of society have really suffered from free or fair trade.
But In the observation of others who follow the process of multilateral trade negotiations, free trade is more about a dream and the principles, but fair trade is more about reality. Sometimes, if handled poorly, free deal or free trade deals could be a nightmare for the domestic consumers. Do you agree?
I do agree. The problem with free trade deals is that the pain is very specific. I mean, those who are negatively affected know who they are, but those who are positively affected are not. If you are a furniture manufacturer in North Carolina, you lost your job because of free trade policies allowed cheaper imports to destroy the industry that you were working in. But at the same time, those same free trade policies increase jobs more broadly in the economy. But those people often don't realize that their prosperity and the cheaper goods that they have, that they're able to buy, come because of free trade agreements.
I add something in terms of free trade. Again, it's a question of what you're pushing for in free trade, because there are certain segments which have been sacrosanct. For example, for the French and the Dutch, agriculture is sacrosanct. Japanese, rice, sacrosanct. But for the US, pushing free trade, especially in the last decade, has been in services, especially financial services, in which it has the strength and dominance over other economies. So free trade pushed by certain governments have things behind it. They're not just a nice expression of principle of free trade. It's to propel your areas of strength into areas in which have not accepted your areas of strength.
But I'm afraid the free movement of human resources that come along with a free trade may wreak havoc with the traditional borders of member states such as the European Union. Do you think this is one of the major concerns for negotiators on both sides across the Atlantic Ocean?
Well, that certainly was a major factor that led to Brexit, of concern about immigration, free immigration within Europe. And I think that motivated many British voters to come out and to vote against the EU, or the UK remaining in the EU. I think we do see concerns everywhere about immigration, although I don't really think free trade agreements have that much to do with immigration.
If that's the major problem with the Brexit vote, what are the major obstacles that get in the way for making any serious progress between the European Union and the United States regarding the TTIP? Because the senior government official from France said basically this process has ground to a halt, and the vice chancellor, also economic minister from Germany, said much the same thing about the prospect of having a successful deal between the two sides about TTIP. Why do they have this strong note of pessimism?
I think the pessimism comes very clearly from the political trend which is developing not only in the US but also all over Europe, that of greater nationalism. And those areas that are sacrosanct should remain sacrosanct. And the demand of the US side, I think the intransigence that they're talking about.
What do you mean by intransigence on the American side?
Well, there are certain things which the Americans demanded. They may demand, of course, all of this is done behind closed doors, but there are various ideas which are being floated as to what's being discussed, one of which is free trade in terms of financial services. And that is the penetration by US financial institutions into European markets. Some in Europe would not like that very much. Now, the other part is reduction of agricultural subsidies by a number of European countries, which, as I described before, are sacrosanct, because they are a very, very powerful voting bloc in countries like France, and possibly parts of Italy as well.
What about what Apple went through in Dublin, Ireland, causing a lot of alert on both sides, and pretty rare that the United States government stepped in to intervene? What do you think of what's going on there?
Well, you know, Apple obviously took advantage of many tax advantages that were available in Ireland, and Ireland probably went overboard in terms of trying to attract multinationals to Ireland. And when those, and now the EU has ruled those tax incentives to be not permitted, I think this probably could have been avoided if the U.S. had found a way to tax Apple before the Europeans did. But as it was, there were billions of dollars sitting there untaxed, and that kind of money is going to attract attention from someone.
Charles, what do you
I
make
go
of?
even further on this. It may be a little Machiavellian, but I think the EU is responding to the fines that the US SEC and the Fed and the like, and the US Treasury Department has been levying on European financial institutions. We've seen over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, 30, 40, $50 billion of fines against European financial institutions. The latest is a chart. Deutsche Bank now owes the US government $14 billion more in fines. And this is why Deutsche Bank's share price has dropped to 1982 lows. And it is geopolitics, I think, that could be behind this more than anything else. Because how can the Europeans respond to the attack on their financial infrastructure or financial institutions? And you respond by going after possibly some companies like Apple and Google and so on. It's unfortunate, but it seems to be tit for tat, tit for tat.
Has Charles made it very clear about the major concerns of the European Union about the intrusion of a major, giant U.S. corporations?
Yeah, I think certainly Europe has become much more protectionist and is concerned about the influence of large corporations. But I think also, what you're seeing there somewhat is a backlash against the tendency, particularly from the U.S., to try to globalize its reach. And
did you see any such signs in the first televised debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump?
Well, you know, obviously both candidates had to come out in the current political environment. They have to be opposed to free trade and opposed to globalization, because that's the trend in American politics right now. It's quite clear the candidacy of Donald Trump has hit a nerve with many Americans who feel that globalization has not resulted in fair trade and that the Americans have been taken advantage of. And so I think we are going to see a much more difficult environment for international cooperation in the future and much greater nationalization across the board.
The moderator of the televised debate asked Donald Trump how he could possibly keep the American jobs there in their homeland. Or to create enough jobs to reindustrialize the American economy.
And he said tax imports.
You'll take it. So what do you think of the prospects of having having creation of more jobs in the next presidential term?
Well, I don't think this is real. I mean, tax imports, that means you're reducing the consumption power of your own consumers. Your own middle class get hurt. And your own people are consumers as well. How would they like it if they have to pay 50%, 100% more for simple products? So I think this is just campaign rhetoric. In reality, it won't happen. And the impact will be more on the US multinationals than on anything else, because the importation of a lot of these goods are sold through the Walmart. So they will be impacted.
To my knowledge, President Obama asked Steve Jobs when he was alive whether he would be able to keep his jobs in the United States market. And Steve said, no, Mr. President, it's impossible. What do you make of this conversation?
Well, I think that's realistic. I mean, what has happened when much of the manufacturing left the United States and came to China is the entire supply chain, all of the suppliers and all the parts and all the logistics have moved to China. And you can't just pick that up and move it back to the United States. That's very difficult. Labor also, which was a big motivator when these things moved abroad, low labor costs in China, is less of a factor. Many of these factories have become much more automated, and labor is less of a component. And what's more important is the efficiency that's available by having all of the suppliers and the logistics all in one place.
I have a simple example. within 1 kilometer of one of my portfolio companies in Shenzhen, every single component can be had. But if you try to do the same thing in Silicon Valley, you have to order them from Singapore, from Korea, from Japan and Taiwan.
Well, this might be a clumsy comparison. It could be called the parallel one. What about, for example, the current transition or transformation and relocation of some of the R&Ds and manufacturing factories from China to other low-income economies on our periphery? What happens in Dongguan, one of the most prosperous cities in Guangdong, may not happen in other countries due to the poor infrastructure and what you call the convenience of logistics, right?
And supply chain. There's another aspect to this. If we talk about Vietnam and some of the other Southeast Asian countries which have taken some of the low knowledge manufacturing jobs, one thing they don't have and no one else has is the Chinese market. Because one of the key factors in terms of efficiency enhancement is the scale. Is the economies of scale. And China has that economies of scale. You have, 200 million middle-class consumers now. And they have the consumption power to absorb a lot of products, which creates the economies of scale and efficiency that allows the Chinese market to be a better market than a market, let's say, Vietnam.
Right. In yet another instance, the fear concerns national sovereignty and the very purpose of government. There are provisions in the pact which would allow corporations to sue governments if they thought the national policies were harmful to their business. A famous related example is the cigarette maker Philip Morris suing the Australian government for requiring generic packaging of tobacco in order to help save lives and protect people's health. Isn't this a reasonable objection?
Yeah, I think many people are concerned about moving towards what they view as a world government, where the rules are made somewhere else and there's no real local input or local considerations. And so you're told by some faceless entity in Brussels that this is how you are going to do things. And I think that was also reflected in the Brexit vote, where people felt that bureaucrats in Brussels were making decisions and they weren't able to make their own decisions about how they wanted to live their own lives.
So not only jobs, but the legislation as well as rules have all been ruthlessly outsourced by a place such as Brussels, the political heartland of the European Union. Do you share the same concern?
Absolutely. Well, I wouldn't share the concern, but I would share this view. Dr. Guz is absolutely right. It's very, very difficult for the bureaucrats in Brussels to actually attend to the local considerations of the farmers in Bordeaux or Tuscany. It's very difficult for them to formulate rules and regulations that local people in different parts of Europe feel can really help them address their problems and issues. And this is, I guess, one of the major issues of EU. And it may eventually be one of the reasons for the breakup of the EU.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with two distinguished guest speakers, Charles Liu, founder of How Capital, and Paul Gillies from Peking University. We're discussing some of the seeming aspects concerning globalization, such as the recent setbacks in the multilateral trade negotiations between European Union and the United States. For example, about the prospects of the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back, gentlemen. Do you share the concern that not all dividends of globalization or free and fair trade in the regional bloc could be shared proportionately?
Yeah, I think that's inevitable. There will be unevenness in the application of any free trade agreement. And this is one of the big problems, is that those who are disadvantaged know it immediately. They lose their jobs. The things that they market that they're selling their goods into becomes cheaper, and they don't, because they lose the protection that was there because of trade barriers. So they know who they are. those who benefit from it, you may work for a company that has more exports. They may work in a community where there's an exporter and things are better. They go to Walmart and they find that the prices are low and they like that, but they don't realize that that's because of free trade.
Do you think this polarization of income or income disparities are getting worse and worse?
It's clearly getting worse and worse. And I think it will even get worse than worse now. This is a side note, but one of the things which some of my portfolio companies have been looking at is further decline in the median income in the US from lowering productivity by humans because of robotics, because of automation. These things are going to take away even more jobs than some of the manufacturing jobs that have been already taken over the last decade. And even in China, Foxconn, for example, is now using massive number of robots.
Yeah, I think we're getting to a point where those without high-level skills are simply unemployable.
That's right.
And the level that's required to even participate in the workforce is much higher than it used to be. And there's going to be a certain proportion of people who just are not going to be able to be functionally employed.
And then
I hate to use a quote by Hillary Clinton, is a half basket of deplorables.
Yeah. The other aspect in terms of this, if you look at the whole U.S. economy in the 1970s and 80s, blue-collar jobs were very, very profitable. I should say profitable. They're middle-class jobs. They gave people a good income, gave their kids the opportunity for a good education, go to college, and so on and so forth. But as the blue-collar jobs declined, the number declined, and the payments declined, you end up with a decline in median income over the last 16 years.
It's exactly my next question, gentlemen. The real issue by the end of the day is the wealth and the well-being of the middle class. Now, the middle class is said to be the very big group that benefit enormously from the process of the globalization. But take the United States. What do you think of the new realities there?
Well, I think the reality definitely has changed. I grew up in a blue-collar family, and my father was able to put 4 kids through college, and we all became successful. The person who's doing his job today can't do that. The wages have declined significantly from what they were, and the opportunity isn't there. So many of those people in those kinds of jobs now are very bitter about and they blame a lot of it on globalization, on immigration, and other problems that are there. And clearly, this is a big problem for society, is how do we deal with those that are in the middle class and with middle class and lower class skills.
And declining prospects for themselves and for their families. It's very unfortunate because, for example, I remember when I went to college, this is 40-some years ago, a college graduate's lifetime income versus a high school graduate's lifetime income is in the hundreds of percents more. I think 350 or 400% more. Today, a college graduate and a high school graduate, aside from having gained maybe $50,000, $100,000 in school loans, student debt, the amount of lifetime income is not that much more. So why would people go to college? Because you don't gain more from it.
The United Kingdom is one of the major economies in the West that foresaw the negative aspects of, for example, multilateral negotiations with the impact of the Brexit vote. What do you think will happen between the United Kingdom and China, despite the recent remarkable progress in the project of Hinkley Point?
Well, I think on the trade side, we're entering a period of some uncertainty here because we don't know how soon the UK will actually be able to achieve Brexit, or whether in fact it will achieve it at all. And then also, even if it does, how do the existing trade agreements play out? they all have provisions that deal with those kinds of possibilities, and they'll have varying terms for it to happen. What I do think we'll see is that the UK will try to reach out and try to do unilateral agreements with China to try to regain anything it lost, or perhaps to get an advantage where it didn't have one. And the problem that the UK will have is it's not the biggest player, and so it's not going to be on the top of the list for any of these negotiations.
One more question about the Brexit impact, Charles. The dynamics and momentum coming out of the process of regional integration with the European Union, I'm afraid, is more about how elites have been able to design the top-end echelon about the regional integration, whilst a majority, what we call the grassroots consumers, may not be the benefits or beneficiaries of the dividends. What do you think of the yawning gap between the elites and the grassroots levels?
Well, it's absolutely there. In the UK, it's the city. The city, which is the financial center, income is many-fold that of the average Brit. In fact, real estate prices in London, if we talk about real estate, is way beyond what an average Brit can afford. Now, it's the same thing in the US, the top 0.1% in terms of their income and their gains with globalization and the development of financial services over the last decades or two is way, way beyond that of the average American. Now, I think all over the place we have the same problem. In Europe, in the Brexit side, Brexit case, I think there's another very, very important issue. I think domestic politics has now become so heated in countries like the UK that people are just catering to segments of populism rather than dealing with a country's long-term strategic survival in a serious manner. Theresa May, did you realize, I was told that her visit to Hangzhou for the G20 was her first ever visit to China. Now, for a new British Prime Minister to have never traveled to Asia or never traveled to China, I think is shocking.
That's pretty common. That's pretty common with most of the lawmakers in the House and the Senate in the United States.
Well, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. How can you deal with global issues if you've never even been there? You know, it's a sign of how domestic politics is now taking precedence
You have
over
indeed
global
pressed a very sexy
collaboration.
button about the issue of globalization and the conservative attitudes of some of the decision makers in the West. Why did Donald Trump say in the first televised debate that NAFTA was a worst disaster concerning the bilateral trade or multilateral trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico?
Well, I think he said that because it appeals to his base. And even though most analysts say that NAFTA really had probably a pretty small effect on things, he made claims that resonated with his fans. And so he is operating as a politician. His arguments are not based on logic or empirical evidence. They're based on what he knows people want to believe. And people want to believe that all of their jobs were taken away by NAFTA, by Mexicans, and by these opportunities. I mean, during the debate, he said that Ford was moving thousands of jobs to Mexico and pulling out its small car market out of the U.S. Ford, during the debate, tweeted out that it wasn't true, what he was saying. But it doesn't matter. No one will pay attention to the fact that his statement was incorrect. It resonates with the person who doesn't have that high-paying job in auto manufacturing that used to exist.
And it's a vicious cycle, in fact, because those jobs used to exist. Unions were powerful. UAW was powerful. The Teamsters were powerful. Today, where are they? Because their members are no longer there. Their members have declined, and their members are no longer politically active. So,
but the scenario in South Africa is completely different. You have so many powerful trade unions competing for their influence and increase in membership. Thank you very much for your participation in this serious dialogue on the prospects of TTIP. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.